some of the implications of that. I was reported by Pedro in the RIBA Journal as having made a lot of witticisms about the English scene. He didn't even mention, sorry Pedro, could you put the light on again? He didn't even mention the semiological issue, which rather upset me, and it does seem to me to be a funny kind of obstruction to considering it on the English or any scene in a way. And so today, in coming back to this issue, I'm going to approach it in a more sidelong fashion and also deal with what seems to me to be much more of an architect's problem in the face of the current impasse, if that's what it is. That's to say, to deal with the question of the general timelessness of visual design, the absence of time in visuals. So this will mean that I'm talking about Manfredo Tafuri a little bit, and then about Le Corbusier. One of the funny things about the situation is that history becomes more and more important. We just don't know what's up ahead. There are a lot of people who are prognosticating and trying to tell us what's there. Even system engineers who are actually managing the big ship don't quite know what's up ahead, and predictions tend to be, disappointed. And it does seem to me that more and more we're coming back on the necessity for history and for historians, not just the memory of history in our buildings, but the ability to interpret and reinterpret our point in relation to the past. And in a funny kind of way, one is impelled into this, starting as a mere practicing architect, one is impelled in this direction. Well, you'll probably gather from now that this is not meant to be a witty talk. I'm not going to give Pedro the chance to do me down again. I'm taking a rather serious approach. The title, Cries and Struggles in the Boudoir, of course, is a reference of a rather Bergmanian kind to architecture, since if you transmute Cries and Struggles into Cries and Whispers, and then substitute Cries and Whispers for architecture, you get the title of Manfredo Tafuri's article in Oppositions 3, L'architecture dans le boudoir, which, when I read it, it really brought me to life as being the first piece of really lively criticism of architecture that I'd come across in years. It seemed to cut right through all the current nonsense about the meaning of these forms, and he dealt with forms which were, by definition, difficult to understand, and he assigned a meaning to them. And when Rowe was very impressed by this, not so impressed by the univalent category of the meaning when it was spelled out, because in fact l'architecture in the boudoir was defined at the end as being simply a set of tautologies which couldn't possibly affect the real world, and which would have to be abandoned if we really wanted to change the real world, which of course would mean abandoning art for political action. And this is the Pedro. I thought he'd be listening. Oh. It's probably a man ringing up to find out what a Rothko painting consists of. Answer 3 rectangles. Anyhow, Well, it might be something to do with the fact that my accelerator broke today. It fell off in the bottom of the car. The priest may have some sort of idea about this. But I mean, what I enjoyed about that Tafuri book, in spite of the fact that it all ends up the spout, was the brilliance of the criticism, the discernment of the step-by-step differentiation between Sterling, Aldo Rossi, Imanino, and the New York Five, and a word for Venturi. This critical path was highly differentiated at every point, and it's only at the end that you find that this gentle criticism, it was quite cruel, but in a sense it's very discerning, is subsumed under the general Marxist criticism of capitalist society. In other words, it is all reduced to a search for pleasure or the relief of anguish, or both together. It's all cries and struggles, and it's all in the boudoir, and in that sense, really, in a way, immaterial. The only alternative that Tafuri offers is that of work, thereabouts. Production, I mean, you know. And it's only just in the last few months, isn't it, that we're beginning to get on to the fact that we intellectuals also work and engage in serious production. So he's going to have to change his terminology when that gets around as a response. In the situation of the artist, architect, and intellectual inside capitalist ideology has no relief except in the serious engagement in what one might call general betterment, the general betterment which is subsumed by, as goals, by social democracy. Social democracy being no good in itself, but allowing an overlap or identification of some of these goals as in part compatible with the goals of revolution. In that sense, people like, in the general line of Dewey pragmatism, are okay. You know, people like Brennan Unwin and Patrick Geddes and so on are okay, because what they are dealing with is betterment at a level of detail which pays respect to the conditions of the worker, and although betterment is not the answer to the conditions of the worker, it nevertheless overlaps with that and allows some exchange to go on. And this seems to be the limit of the participation that Tafuri is prepared to undertake. And even then, it's only as an interim measure. But on the other hand, given that that's the final judgment, his attitude towards Sterling and Le Corbusier in particular, and also towards Aldo Rossi, is more than tinged with respect. So I was led to ask why Tafuri is so impressed with certain of the results of architects who are merely investigating form, and while condemning the totality of this emanation as nothing but a boudoir architecture, still looks to it as making some clarification. For instance, he says of Eisenman's works, which are self-explicit in a thoroughly didactic way. Peter always spells out just what the system is that he's put into motion. In the face of such products, the task of criticism is to begin from within the work, only to escape from it as soon as possible, so as not to be caught in the vicious circle of a language that speaks only of itself. Well, I kind of like that when contrasted with his approach to Sterling, which goes, I turned over to, oh yes, the object of criticism here is to break the magic circle that the work draws round itself. Criticism must place it in a frame of so and so on. So Sterling generates a magic circle and Eisenman a vicious circle, and there seems to be in that appraisal some mark rather, of a preference, an enjoyment, which old Tafuri has had of the actual architecture. I think, in fact, he enjoys Sterling terrifically, and that the fact that I don't enjoy Eisenman all that much would be my confirmation that he has something there. The difference in the description seems to convey, in fact, a direct personal response, especially as he makes clear that they are both futile in the sense that they both constitute systems which are tautologies, speaking only to themselves and perversely closed in on themselves. So it seems as if within the general condemnation of these things, these displays, there is still a scale of values that operates. But Tafuri's real warmth is reserved for the case of Aldo Rossi. I was supposed to be having some slides. I wonder if it's worthwhile having this. Yeah. Well, they seem to have come in at Rossi, so that's rather convenient. A switch? A position? Oh, we need to go back on the slides. I thought you were trying to drive me into a corner. Well, you're meant to have these pictures of, won't come up, of Jim Sterling's work while I was referring to him. Not necessarily the same examples that Tafuri quotes, but he does insist on the remarkable consistency of the Sterling system, which combines not only references to the functional meanings of things, but also to an historical dimension. This is not perhaps seen so much in the Siemens thing. The historical dimension may be rather one of architectural evolution, the modern movement itself, but in the Derby City Hall, the arch would be, the arch form of the vault would be, in fact, reminiscent of classical antecedents. And Sterling therefore combines memory along with function, and in that sense is a curiously satisfying system, according to Tafuri. I imagine that this drawing, if it's not by Leon, is by somebody like Leon, whereas this one, I think, comes from an earlier epoch, and you can see the change in Sterling as he proceeds from a kind of simple-minded concern with the task in hand, which nevertheless has its resonances, you know, whether they're ships or not, to a more overt concern with the historical resonance, which he has himself now finally admitted in his response to Charles Jencks in saying that he would have thought he was rather a neoclassical architect. Sterling comes in there for Tafuri's praise. Oops. But Aldo Rossi receives his special approval, and the reason for this is that Rossi appears to go so far in the architecture of meaning that it becomes neither a reference in function nor a reference in history. It becomes a kind of timeless and absolute reference, architecture as a sublime and useless art, so that Rossi is the architecture of the empty sign. This, believed it or not, are designs for a student's residential building, and it's not only the drawings which convey the sense of a kind of pitiless machine, but it seems that, according to Tafuri, Rossi actually has in mind the death of architecture. He wishes to assassinate architecture, and therefore he has to remove it beyond, as it were, functional or naturalistic criticism and make it very rigorous in itself. Whether or not this actually happens, whether or not one does perceive these forms as empty, is, in my view, doubtful. In my view, forms are never empty. If they appear empty, their emptiness is intended, I think, to be significant. And in any case, it is measured and received as a particular quantum of emptiness. So I won't dwell on that now, but before I pass to Venturi, I will just like to read what Tafuri sees good in Rossi. The categorical imperative lies in the absolute alienation of form to the point of achieving an empty sacredness, an expression of the immovable and of the eternal return to geometric emblems reduced to being mere ghosts. Thus, Rossi demonstrates that by removing form from the domain of daily experience, he is continually forced to circumnavigate the central point from which communication springs forth, yet is unable to draw from the source itself because the center has been historically destroyed. And he then goes on to quote Simmel in a marvelous quotation, I think. Simmel says, "A form which is open to life and serves it cannot give it itself." So Rossi, for Tafuri, attempts to actually withdraw from life. Never mind it is a student's hostel block. You can live in practically anything nowadays. And by withdrawing from life, he actually, in a sense, marks the impotence of architecture. And therefore, his work appears to bring useful evidence to Tafuri's point of view. And that is presumably why he approves of him. Finally, and I'm dealing with L'architecture dans le Boudoir, for those of you who haven't read it, finally, after dismissing the New York Five rather summarily, Tafuri discusses Venturi, limiting himself to the Denise Scott Brown aspect of Venturi, architecture as a popular spectacle. Las Vegas made all right, I would say. And by the same token demolishes the whole idea of architecture as signs, that is, as a sign-posted channel of communication to the people. To the people means simply manipulation of the people. It's essentially a cosmetic job and runs downhill with the consumer it seeks to please in exactly the same way as do the products of the Madison Avenue market implementation boys. Well, I do confess to a disappointment in the way he dismisses the whole semiological movement, very much in the way that Tomás Maldonado does, Maldonado writes of Venturi using the term Las Vegas and the semiological abuse. It's true, of course, that Venturi's interpretation of semiology is a highly biased and limited one, and it doesn't bring us to the study of signs and significations in any kind of scientific sense. But that study, in my view, need not be committed to perpetuating a particular rhetoric, given that a rhetoric is the unavoidable condition of life in society. Life is impossible without rhetoric, and if you don't believe that, I'll have to leave it for another day to work on it, but it should perhaps help if I mention that Althusser, the archpriest of the new Marxism, states that it is so, that there is no society conceivable without a rhetoric. And so if a rhetoric is unavoidable in society, if it is in fact the bond of ready-made meanings which bind people together, then it seems to me that we need to try to understand its operations, not simply its operations insofar as they are those of Madison Avenue or the military-industrial complex, but insofar as they are inescapable aspects of society. So, for instance, as I mentioned last time, the uses of rhetoric in the peasant paintings of central China, which are now in an exhibition, use rhetoric in a very clear-cut way. And Caroline Tisdale's article in The Guardian made this clear by quoting some of the artists in terms of showing how they had, for instance, enlarged the size of the cabbages and reduced their number in order to make the loaded barrel of cabbages more understandable, and so on. The difference between rhetoric in bourgeois, rotten bourgeois society and rhetoric after the revolution then would appear to be to do with its transparency. That is to say, its purpose in the new society is to encourage people to work and to inspire them with the correctness of their lot in working and with the aims of liberation which are implied. But there is somehow in Tafuri and in other Marxist critics, such as Barth, a kind of obtuseness to the particular rhetoric of bourgeois society, which is the one that we're all swimming in, insofar as they consider it to be not simply necessary, but a massive con job, necessary to them, but one which must be unmasked. And all through Tafuri, we have an alteration between the necessity of unmasking the bourgeois rhetoric which abounds, the ideology which contaminates every gesture, and at the same time, the statement which happens at least 3 times that this rhetoric fools nobody because he can see through it. This alternation between knowing that it's no good and yet claiming that it fools most people most of the time seems to be part of the irritation which Tafuri feels for the work of which is engendered within capitalism. And so for him, architecture in the boudoir, which could be said to be boudoir architecture or bourgeois architecture, is simply the kind of architecture that we have seen displayed very often in this salon, probably at this moment, in spite of the fact that I know the individual artists here would consider their content to be highly subversive. They have to persuade Tafuri that it's genuinely subversive and not just an attempt to, as it were, express the anguish for another time and accommodate our catharsis to the impossible situation that we all enjoy, we who have cars and hi-fis. Well, I mean, I don't want to say anything against Peter Cook because I love ArtNet, and its disappearance from the scene, if it ever disappears, and I suppose that's possible, will be a real loss to me, if not to others. What we've seen here has ranged across quite a wide width, I think, even though it has all been recognizably art and architecture, from the melting hedonism of Peter himself, whose apparent innocence about the Freudian or even Sadian implications of his Arcadia are themselves a source of unending delight, to work which by its repetition or its abrasiveness does suggest a genuine attack on bourgeois values. But it's all implacably condemned by Tafuri, presumably, because in fact we are all drugged in the same way, all searching for a lost cause, all trying to retrieve is the word, retrieve or recuperate. These are the words which are used to signify some compromise with the forces of life, which nevertheless bring us back to an aspect of les constants humains, those old appetites which Corbusier so well understood and even expressed. Some content, in fact, of art conceived as for the enjoyment of life, the here and now, whatever the privilege of the position, whatever the fact that millions are dying of hunger, etc., outside, within the warmth of the boudoir, all trying to achieve the impossible. Tafuri's absoluteness of condemnation makes even Ken Frampton seem to be the soul of optimism. That's saying something. I know that ArtNet is, in fact, supported, I don't think it's a secret, by funds from a certain capitalist coffer, and that it dispenses cheap wine with the bravura of the chief steward on the Titanic. Not much of what happens here would escape Tafuri's bleak judgment on architecture as art. Are we all then boudoir boys? Alternatively, we can read this salon as no worse than any other in London tonight, in town tonight, compared to them, no worse. Well now, the method of achieving this total destruction on bourgeois emanations which Tafuri has, is by reading the kind of circular action with a very sharp pair of dividers. I'll explain this metaphor in a little bit more detail. The dividers have 2 points, one of which is firmly placed in the goal, I almost said groove, of revolution in class liberation, which everybody knows is a simple end of development. And the other is used to lacerate the remaining map of culture or pretensions and bourgeois emanations with great circular arcs which in fact deface as they dissect the works in front of him. The same criticism in fact is used on all, whatever the detail of enjoyment which he himself has taken from the works. Only this single goal is stated and used to provide not so much a framework of criticism as a point of criticism. There is no question that his criticism illuminates what is laid bare, but it only does it in order to expose these cries and struggles of an unwilling death or an unworthy copulation. I was meant to have, yes, that at that point. I don't honestly know whether that's an unworthy copulation. It's entitled Fragment de Lit, and that's the inference I've put on it. So I turned then, having given you that account of l'architecture dans le Boudoir and my comments on it, I turned then to Tafuri's book, now available at the London Art Bookshop at a cost of £7.50, which you see on the right, a small book, which I have noticed people flinch when they look at the price, but then that's because we're used to books having a lot of pictures and things. In this book, we have a much more detailed examination of the roots of alienation in art and architecture within the bourgeois state. Instead, however, of stressing the growth of complexity and of material within concrete projection, I'm using Maldonado's term, he confines himself to conceptions of the city and of its artificiality. The city, I quote, "It's not just by chance that the metropolis, the place of absolute alienation, is at the very center of concern of the avant-garde." In dealing with the city as a theater of life, Tafuri deals first with the absorption of 18th century landscape theory into the view of the city, so that it too could be regarded as a work of nature, full of felicities, but also of dangers, contradictions, and clashes. A view, of course, which has been resuscitated, if that can be put along with recuperated and so on, resuscitated by Colin Rowe in his Koolhaas City. Colin, this is a byline. Colin, by the way, appears to imagine that we can enjoy utopias in fragments without committing ourselves to the whole problem of actually building them. And that's a point of view which I very much appreciate and enjoy, and yet can't help feeling that it's in some curious way naive. This view of the city as nature, of course, was a way of ignoring the actual process of incipient urban capitalism, which were arising all through the 18th century out of agricultural land ownership applied in the city. Hoskin's book, The Making of the English Countryside, would be the best preamble to a consideration of how that ownership is applied to cities. And those were the forces that actually transformed the city and made it into the jungle it is today. The introduction of picturesque theory into the townscape was intended to enable the city to attain the richness and unaccountability, I think, of nature, observing the functional and economic role of the city in relation to production. The masking, thereby, of the necessary conditions of economic life by making them appear not inescapable but natural is the principal aim of ideology. a picture of nature as the pole against which man is set and from which he has emerged. That's the necessary framework in order to mask the contamination of nature by the values and by the method of society. This is Hoskins' picture of what surmised to be the primeval landscape in England before anything human happened. It's a reconstruction, of course. And this is landscape after English gentility had laid its hand on it, the architectural view not even having been invented then, but very much in the background. The perfection of nature is the reference point also of Billet's attempt. Oh yes, well I just wanted to put in here a little game of my own, which was to imagine Versailles laid out not on the natural oak forest or chestnut forest of the middle of France, but in some kind of rather enlarged equatorial Africa where the scale would change. It's just a way of a little joke in thinking about how nature was cut up, dissected by the past at Versailles, and yet in a curious kind of way it was a threat. If one was caught out hunting, one might in fact be laid by a footpad or something, and what a threat it would be if it was actually a jungle. Let's pass on quickly. Billet attempts to extend the role of architecture in society by reference to the perfection of nature. That's his reference point. Bringing it to bear, of course, not on the mundane, but on the sublime. This would be an attempt to explore the practical limits of man through his ritual accommodation to reasons, to ideas, and to reason. But reason as a god is curiously unprincipled and puts no barriers to the rush into infinity and absolutes of freedom. So thus the experiments of de Sade, and above all for Tafuri of Piranesi, these explorers of the limits of what is not only permissible but possible. Piranesi, a very special case for Tafuri, because he exemplifies the deliberate search for the boundaries of reason and nature within man himself. But he does this by architectural projection. And then we have this marvelous picture from Piranesi of the reconstruction of the Campo Marzio, which is meant to be a kind of